Good evening. Good evening. This evening, Debbie is watching a movie called AlphaGate, which is about the intermingling of two worlds in two different dimensions. So I thought I would do a reading that involves the two worlds that we're living in the United States in terms of current affairs. And I'm going to be reading tonight from America on the Couch by Pythia Pei. Psychological perspectives on American politics and culture. And before that, so what I'm going to read is Pythia's 1994 interview with Edward Edinger. And Dr. Edinger was one of the leading Jungian analysts of the 20th century. Dr. Edinger was one of the leading analysts of the 20th century. And he made a comment once that in the end, humanity will become all one thing, or we will be destroyed. We will destroy ourselves. And obviously, we already have the possibility of destroying ourselves. And it's been a close thing a few times. And that comes from the interaction of the opposites. And so in our advanced reading group, for about 8 months now, we've been reading this book, Mysterium Conjunctionis by C.G. Jung, which is volume 14 of the collected works. And I just want to read the first sentence of this book. It's quite a task to understand the whole thing, but it all boils down to this. He's talking about the components of the conjunctio, the opposites. The factors which come together in the conjunctio are conceived as opposites, either confronting one another in enmity or attracting one another in love. And so that's what happens in the human race, and that's what Dr. Edinger was talking about when he said that we will either destroy ourselves or we will become all one thing, all one species with similar beliefs. Hard to believe, I know, but that's where it is. And so with that preface, I'm going to go ahead and read this interview between Pythia Pei and Edward Edinger. Now, let me do one other thing. I do have this system on a Zoom panel type thing. And so if you wish to join me for discussion of this afterward, you can come to that link and you will be right on the screen in the panel with me. So if you do that, you're giving your consent to be on this video and to be both live and in the video replay. Hello, Grenade. Grenade says, students who reported more conservative political views tended to have larger amygdalae, a structure in the temporal lobes that performs a primary role in the processing of and memory of emotions. So is your point that conservative people are more emotional? I'm not quite sure what that would tell us. You can give us your opinion on that as we go on here. So I'm going to read this 12-page interview and then come back to you. So Grenade says, on the other hand, more liberal students tended to have a larger volume of gray matter in the anterior cingulate cortex, a structure of the brain associated with monitoring uncertainty and handling conflicting information. Thought that was interesting. That is interesting. I'll have to think about that one some more. Okay, but I'm reading tonight from America on the Couch by Pythia Pei, and I'm reading the first interview that she did for this book. It's more than a 550-page book with interviews of about 50 Jungian analysts about the current psychological situation in the United States. And it so happens that Dr. Edinger was late in life in 1994. He died in 1998, but he was one of the most significant Jungian analysts at the time that Pythia began this research. And so she interviewed him first, but the interview comes on page 546. It's the last interview that she puts in the book. America, the last best hope of the world. An interview with Edward Edinger, MD. Jungian analyst Edward Edinger was the first psychologist I interviewed on the American psyche. So it seems fitting that our interview should bring this book to its conclusion. The year was 1994. I was steeped in my own personal Jungian analysis, and I had just begun my years-long journey to understand the American psyche through a psychological lens. Reading Edinger's book, Ego and Archetype, Individuation and the Religious Function of the Psyche, I'd become fascinated with how Jung's idea of the individuation process deepened American ideas around individualism. So often, it seemed to me, the individual in modern day culture seemed untethered to anything greater than meeting the demands of day-to-day needs. This was not a moral judgment, as like everyone else, I was juggling as well as I could the demands of work and family. But was this, I wondered, the fulfillment of the American individual? Or did something more come with that choicest accident of fate and history of having been born in the land of the free and the home of the brave? Did only soldiers fight for America, or were there other ways of serving and defending the country? These were some of the feelings behind the questions I took to Edinger, and which he answered in the most inspiring, patriotic manner. But before we began our interview, he had a few things to say to me. First, he wondered, writing out of my was I, he wondered, writing out of my individual experience? Because, he continued, if you know what I'm talking about from your own experience, you can write out of that. But if you haven't learned it by your individual experience, then you're just playing with ideas, and then I'm afraid that what you have to write won't amount to much. I replied hopefully that the impetus for this project has indeed arisen out of my own inner psychological inner work, dreams, and creative process. Then, Edinger said, that's what you must be thinking about all the time as you write. It's difficult to make a bridge, but you have to find some way to translate and to give an expression to whatever insights you've gained. Sometimes referred to as an American Jungian, Dr. Edinger was born in 1923 in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He was a medical officer in the U.S. Army in Panama. After practicing as a supervising psychiatrist in a psychiatric hospital, he began studying with Esther Harding, one of Jung's first students. Eventually, Edinger became a Jungian analyst himself. He was also a founding member of the New York Jung Center, a frequent lecturer at the Los Angeles Jung Center, and wrote more than 14 books expanding upon Jung's ideas. In the following interview, Edinger's ideas about America's archetypal role in world history provided a revelatory experience, as did his ideas about the work of conscious individuality, the work of differentiating who we truly are from the conventions and collective norms of society as a form of citizenship and a more genuine fulfillment of what it means to be an individual. During our conversation, Edinger was intent on educating me about America's place along the continuum of history, how its vision of democracy emerged out of the cultural convulsions of the 16th century, and how this historical individuation process continues to unfold in our struggles around immigration. He brings our interview to a ringing conclusion with his discussion of America's great task of multiculturalism and how, if the country can hold together despite the tensions of a body politic comprised of citizens of various ethnicities, it might fulfill its purpose of bringing about world unification and peace to the planet. It was a perspective that inspired me anew about being an American, even as I go about my daily tasks, shopping for food at the grocery store or chatting with my neighbors. I hope it will inspire others as well. And that's her preliminary to this interview. So here's the interview. Pay. My first question concerns the Jungian principle of individuation and how it might deepen our American understanding of the individual. For example, in your book, Ego and Archetype, you say that the basis for almost all psychological problems lies in an unsatisfactory relationship to one's urge toward individuality. So perhaps you could begin by speaking to this issue. Edinger. I'll be glad to do that, but I think I need to preface my remarks on the individual with my more general picture of how I see America as a phenomenon of history as a whole. Jung has laid the groundwork for this in all his work, especially in his book, Ion, for what I called archetypal psychohistory, a whole new discipline of study. We've had the development of psychohistory in the last few decades, but archetypal psychohistory has more of a personal nature. Pei, can you say more about what you mean by archetypal psychohistory? Edinger, I mean the unfolding drama of archetypal processes as they manifest in the collective history of the human race. All viable societies have at their core a central collective religious myth that represents the God image for that civilization. America, for instance, is an offshoot of Western European civilization, which was hatched out of the theological mythology of the early Christian church. As Western civilization unfolded, critical developments occurred around the beginning of the 16th century that led to a change in the Western ego. This began during the Protestant Reformation when, in effect, the traditional God image in the sky fell out of heaven from its century-old places in the metaphysical system of the medieval church and into the human psyche. The energy that was released from this fueled individual initiative and in turn helped to give rise to the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and the beginning of the great geographical explorations. The colonization of America was a result of those great geographical explorations. Pei, I'm not sure I understand what you mean by God falling out of the sky and into the human psyche and how that triggered these enormous changes and cultural movements. Edinger, the core idea The core idea underlying the Protestant Reformation was that every individual should be able to have his or her own direct relationship to God, without the intermediaries of the church or priests. Thus, the Reformation inevitably led to the splitting up of the church into more and more denominations. Carried to its ultimate conclusion, the Protestant Reformation results in an almost infinite number of denominations, each with a membership of one. That's the very nature of the Reformation. So that's how individualism gets into the American society so prominently. This symbolism of each person's individual relationship to the deity is also the essence of Jung's individuation process. The main point I want to make, however, is that North America was largely colonized by the Puritans, who were an outgrowth of the Protestant Reformation, with the underlying conviction, and here is where the archetypal image of American origins comes in, that they were repeating the journey to the promised land. This is the Old Testament narrative of the exodus of the Jews from Egypt. They're wandering in the wilderness as they traveled through inhospitable territory, and their arrival in Canaan, where they had to conquer the previous inhabitants in order to be given what Yahweh had promised them. This archetype of the journey to the promised land lived itself out quite specifically with the early colonists, who felt that they were fleeing persecution. It gave them the incentive to fulfill what they felt was their divine mandate to leave Europe and to make the crossing over the wilderness of the ocean. Eventually, they arrived in the new promised land of the New World, where very shortly they had to oust the current occupants, the Indians, and set up a theocracy. So to follow up on your question concerning the individual, the imagery that lies behind the entire historical collective phenomenon of the colonization, expansion, and consolidation of America is the imagery of individual development as it initially arose out of the Protestant Reformation. That's why it makes sense that although the colonization movement started out as a collective undertaking, the archetypal background behind it led to more and more of an emphasis on the individual. So it's certainly true that individual development is a prominent feature of American society and of our culture and history. Pay. And where are we today with regard to that historical evolution around the rise of the individual? Edinger. We emphasize human rights a great deal. That's a big issue with the conscious America. But what we're noticing in modern times is that although individuality is very consciously America's virtue and our value, there's been a very sizable unconscious backlash, so that we're becoming more and more collective. For a long while, we had the Soviet Union to project our collective shadow upon. Now that's breaking down, and I think we're going to be more exposed to the realization about how collective we're actually becoming, even while touting our conscious values around individualism. Pay. Can you give me some specific examples of what you mean by that? I think you're saying that the shadow side of our country may be a sameness or conformity. Edinger. Yes, there's unconscious conformity. A clear modern current example is the phenomenon of political correctness, which is becoming so prominent and is also true in our general behavior. Pay. Do you mean examples of neighborhoods with their neat lawns all in a row? Editor, that's an obvious example. I'm thinking more in terms of our way of thinking and what's permitted to be said and what isn't permitted. The general attitudes and categories that operate in our collective public discourse are all collective. The containers of value that are generally acknowledged are all collective churches, family, political organizations, ideological factions, or isms of various kinds, what Jung called the wretched isms. These are the general containers of our psychic and spiritual values, and they're all collective. Pei, so you mean there's no cultural container for the individual? Edinger, the individual is the individual container, but he is apt to get pretty short shrift because everything is governed by statistics. Jung goes into this in The Undiscovered Self. Pei, I wonder if you could say more about something you wrote in Ego and Archetype, that our era could be called the age of alienation. Edinger, here's the way I see it. As I said, American culture is a branch, bud, or outgrowth of Western civilization as a whole. But it's going through a crisis because it's lost its core religious mythology. That's true for Western society, and it's also true for America. What once held society together is a common God image that we all shared and that was embedded in the metaphysical myths of Christianity. But now that's dissolved. I don't care whether church attendance has gone up statistically or not. So far as the general American psyche is concerned, the effective functioning of that myth is gone. Nietzsche was right a century ago when he announced the fact that God is dead, and that's been a catastrophe for society. Pei, are you saying that this loss of our core faith is similar to a natural catastrophe, like a flood or an earthquake, but on a psychological level? Edinger, yes, but on an even greater universal level, as it affects the civilization as a whole, not just one section of it. And since America is the youngest living edge of Western civilization, it's going to manifest the phenomenon of the descent into chaos more quickly than the older, longer established, more historically based European aspects of the civilization. We're seeing that now in terms of violence and general disorganization and fragmentation. Part of it is a regression to anachronistic, factional fundamentalism of various kinds that start warring with one another. We're seeing that in Eastern Europe now as communism breaks down as well. I view what's going on in the former communist country Bosnia as a preview or a coming attraction of what's going to take place in America and eventually in Europe too. There's an inevitability to the situation. I'm sorry to say, but I think it's better to state it baldly, but I think it's better but I think it's better to state it baldly. Pei, that sounds frightening. Edinger, well, it's better to be prepared. Jung has spelled this all out in his book, Answer to Job, for those that are willing and able to hear. The world is in for a vast Job experience, which means having to undergo catastrophic events for the purpose of the discovery and transformation of the God image. I have written a little book on Jung called Transformation of the God Image. My books have historical reference because what is history? It is no more than the sum total story of all the individuals that go into making it up. but it's got individual psychology at its core. Pay. Much of this book is about ways people can recognize collective forces influencing their individual lives and how they can find their own way to relate to these larger forces and to live as best they can. So what does an individual who is experiencing this sense of loneliness and alienation think or do? Edinger. First, realize that it's an individual experience and that it exists in the collective only because a sum total of individuals are feeling it. So just as its origin is in the individual, so healing this existential crisis is to be found in the individual, one person at a time. So if a person is feeling alienated, then his or her task is to discover the inner psychic realities of his or her individual existence and to reconnect with the lost God image within. To the extent that individuals do that, they're contributing to the redemption of society as a whole. Pay. Is it important in this process to learn the difference between the ego and what Jung called the self? In other words, can individuals learn once and again how to relate to that core within them as the divine source? Edinger. That's the whole point of Jungian psychology, the whole thing in a nutshell. That's what my book is all about. Okay, since he says that, I'm going to read those two statements again. Pei says, is it important in this process to learn the difference between the ego and the self? In other words, can individuals learn once again how to relate to that core within them as the divine source? Edinger. That's the whole point of Jungian psychology, the whole thing in a nutshell. That's what my book is all about. Pei. I don't know if I can recommend everyone go into Jungian analysis or if that would even be the right thing for everyone. But there is a growing receptivity and even a hunger now to relate to something larger and more transpersonal. Edinger. There's no point in everyone going into Jungian analysis, but there is a desperate longing because, as Thoreau wrote a century and a half ago, the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. That's compounded many times currently. It's very widespread, even while everybody is consciously spending all their time and thoughts in largely material matters. Pei. So if a person wanted to cultivate a relation with the self or God within, and they weren't involved in Jungian psychology or any other spiritual path, what steps could they take? What advice would you give? Edinger. One thing I would tell people right away is to rehabilitate Emerson. He's pretty much gone by the board. I think it's absolutely disgraceful that he doesn't get major attention in all the public high schools. Aside from a few sentences in American Lit class, you can go all the way through high school and never hear of him. But he's the wisest man American soil has produced, and he was the prophet of the individual. Now, Emerson can be misunderstood, and he is often criticized for overemphasizing individualism at the expense of the welfare of society. But that's a misunderstanding, largely because Emerson's great intuitive powers perceived what we now call the self, the transpersonal center of the individual. But he didn't have the terminology to distinguish that from the ego. Individualism, if it's ego-centered, is selfish, greedy individualism. But individualism is not, But individuation is of another order. It's the development of the individual out of an awareness of the transpersonal center of the individual psyche, and that transforms selfishness to a whole new conscious level of a religious order. Pay. So you think Emerson is an important historical and even spiritual figure for America? Edinger, yes, because he was related to the inner life. He had a real living connection to the transpersonal dimension of the psyche. Pay, in a way that was archetypal or essentially American. Edinger, well, his work is universal, but he was an American and he arrived out of the American experience. So he's our gateway to the objective psyche. Hello, Graham. Thank you for that gift. I appreciate that. Grace says, Skip, you are contributing to the redemption of society. I know it. Can you talk about the Job archetype and how it helps prepare and separate the ego from the self? Okay, let me just look. Okay. So the Job archetype, very simply, and I'll come back to this interview in a moment, but the Job archetype simply is contest, defeat, lamentation, and rebirth. And basically what that says is that throughout life, we have to go through many times this cycle. In other words, you come up against some roadblock and you can't go forward in what you were planning to do or what you were doing. And so then you have to go on and reinvent yourself. And so for high school students, as an example, maybe they are a football player or they think they're a football player. They'd like to be a football player. I speak from my experience. And they imagine themselves as a great running back or something like that. And I had such imagination. But when I was playing in high school football, the average weight of my team was 164 pounds. And the heaviest guy on the team was 195 pounds, but I weighed 125 pounds. And so I very quickly realized that I wasn't really cut out for football. And I never did grow big enough to do it anyway. But that's a far cry from Malcolm Perry and his over 300 yards that he gained in the Army-Navy game yesterday. And so for most students have my experience, that is, they're defeated in something like football or something else, maybe it's academics, and they lament about that, and then they have to be reborn into doing something else. In my case, I became reborn as an actor, which proved to be a great thing because then I got to kiss all the girls in the plays because somehow people thought I was ought to play the male leads in these high school plays. And so while the football players were out getting dirty, I was kissing the girls. That was pretty cool. And so anyway, but these cycles can happen almost daily to us, and they happen to us throughout life. Some can be roadblocks of major proportion, and some are not so big. One of my major ones was that I thought I wanted to become a lawyer, and so I spent 8 years going to law school and then practicing law. And at first it was going very well. I enjoyed law school very much. and um, and then I started to practice law. And when I started to practice law, I realized that I absolutely detested the practice of law. I couldn't stand it. So I did it for 5 years. But then I lamented about that. And then I went on to a business career and never really looked back except for things I do for myself in law. And so that was a major roadblock because I had thought that was my career and it wasn't. And it turned out that I did fairly well in business over the years. But I did run into a lot of contests and defeats through my business career, and so that happens to us all the time, and so it's an ego defeat. And when you lament in the Job archetype sense, then you have to go back and dig up what really drives you. How can you be something else? I mean, if we sometimes compare individuation to what a tree does, an oak tree is an oak tree, but every oak tree is different. So if an oak tree is there and it's suddenly putting out a branch and the branch gets pretty big, but then some telephone company lineman comes along and cuts that branch off, then the oak tree has to figure out how it's going to survive in another way. And sometimes it can put out another little shoot in that same place, but usually it's cut off. And so it puts its energy that's coming up through its trunk and its sap into other branches of the oak tree. And so it is in all of us that if some branch is cut off, as my interest in practicing law was cut off, I wasn't going to keep putting energy into that branch. And so I had to reinvent myself and decide what my new branch would be. So that's a question of inner work. It's a question, I hope I've answered your question because I saw that you were saying something about the ego and the self. But when your ego, what you're doing, your ego says, okay, we're doing this, we're doing this, we're doing this, we're doing this. So, it's the kid in the weight room who's trying to do well in the football team. And so he's lifting weights. And then all of a sudden he's out on the football field one fine day and he breaks his leg. And so he's not going to play football anymore. and so then you have to go within yourself and find what strength you have to be something else, I think. I hope that helps. Do archetypes apply to all organisms? Yes, and yes, assuredly. I'm very new to Jung's material. Don't worry, Killer Bee, there's no good place to start. You just dive in and keep going. Anyway, Ray, I hope I have answered your question, and thank you very much for your super chat tonight. I appreciate that very much. So now let me go back. I'm halfway through and I'm reading an interview of Edward Edinger in America on the Couch by Pythia Pei. And Dr. Edinger was one of the leading Jungian analysts of the 20th century. He died in 1998. Okay, so he's talking about Emerson here, And Pei says, so you think Emerson is an important historical and even spiritual figure for America? Edinger, yes, because he was related to the inner life. He had a real living connection to the transpersonal dimension of the psyche in a way that was archetypally or even essentially American. Edinger, well, his work is universal, but he was an American and he arrived out of the American experience. So he's our gateway to the objective psyche. Pei, which of his essays is in particular would you point to? Edinger, the Oversoul, quote unquote, an Emerson essay called The Oversoul. All of his essays explore this in one way or another, but this one describes it most explicitly. Pei, you've also spoken about the individuation process as it applies to a whole nation. Could you talk about that in terms of America's individuation process? Edinger, what I see going on in world history is a process that mirrors what goes on in the process of the individual. One of the features of the individuation process is the way a fragmented psyche that is made up of unconscious complexes and that work against the conscious ego can be progressively brought into a state of unification. And world history, I think, has its goal unification. And that means political unification and psychological unification. Needless to say, we're a long way from that. But through understanding the symbolism of the individuation process, one can see that if the human race survives, world unification will eventually happen. And of course, Edinger's position was that we're either going to have world unification or we're going to destroy ourselves, because we know about nuclear weapons that if you pop off somewhere between 23 and 100 of them, you destroy all life on Earth. And so given that we have 10,000 of them in our arsenals, it's a big possibility that the human species could destroy itself. Now, America is a kind of advanced laboratory for the world in that regard. We're the one nation that on principle has turned itself into a microcosm of the world as a whole. We've got the most open borders of any nation in the world, and on principle, we are a nation of immigrants from all over the world. We've got little communities all over the United States that represent every major ethnic and national entity in the whole world. So when something goes on in another country, there's a demonstration in front of the White House for that particular community. We are a microcosm of the world, and we're the experimental laboratory for world unification. And that's why our motto is E pluribus unum. That's an individuation motto. Pei, can you say more about why E pluribus unum is an individuation motto? Edinger, it means from the many, one, just as the psyche starts out as a multiplicity. So the goal of the individuation process is that wholeness can be achieved by the integration of its totality into a unity. Pei, so that we're seeing that acted out in Edinger. America is living that historically in miniature as a microcosm of the world. And that's why we're the last best hope of the world. We really are. And if we don't make it, the world hasn't got a chance. And if we do make it, then the world has a model that makes it likely that it can make it too. It's a big deal as I see it. We're experiencing a lot of pain and distress because of our diversity. Certain nations that have more or less ethnically uniform populations don't have that same problem. Japan, for example, is a good example of ethnic uniformity. And while they can criticize us for all of our problems around diversity, Our diversity is part of our historical purpose and the purpose of our existence as a country. It's part of what makes us the hope of the world, because America is diverse, just as the world itself is diverse. Thus, the task is for one national entity to be able to integrate that diversity into a unity, e pluribus unum, without splitting. That's what Lincoln realized. And that is what made the Civil War so crucially important psychologically. Together with Emerson, he's the other great historical figure in American history. Lincoln recognized that if the overriding value was the Union, then it had to be Union at all costs. And this is because it's our country's historical purpose. I'm not sure if Lincoln perceived that at the level that I'm articulating now, but his sound instincts sensed this, and he gave everything for the Union. As I said earlier, the U.S. has been living out the same archetype of the sacred land that ancient Israel lived out. But ancient Israel failed not long after it attained its greatest success under King Solomon. It split apart into a northern and a southern kingdom, and then was later destroyed by invaders. And that was the same issue that confronted Lincoln during the Civil War. Were we going to split apart the way ancient Israel did? And in fact, we broke that archetypal pattern and we didn't split. Lincoln was the one that saved us. He could have agreed to secession and there would not have been a civil war, but he didn't do that, and he paid a terrible price for it. We see minor versions of the Civil War all around us as the various diverse competing factions that make up our totality as a country deal with one another. The problem is whether or not they will succeed in fragmenting us as a nation, or whether the historical purpose of the unification of the many will be able once again to predominate. Pay. On a practical level, the struggle of America to hold together almost always comes down to a boundary issue. How many people should we let in? And should we have more border patrols? And how can we live together despite all of the cultural differences? Edinger. We have to be able to control our borders. Otherwise, we won't be a vessel. If we become too porous, we will lose our containing capacity entirely within our borders, and that will hinder unification. Pay. So how does that work out on an everyday level? For example, in schools with large segments of Latino or Asian or Arab-speaking children all in the same classroom, or other situations of cultural diversity. Edinger. I'll tell you exactly what the task is. The task is to provide education in our public schools right down to the elementary level that all individuals need to be taught on principle that identification with ethnic, political, and ideological factions is not permitted. Conscious relationship to these various ethnic roots is greatly to be desired, but identification is not permitted. Why do you warn against this kind of religious cultural identification? Edinger. Because identifications are unconscious phenomena. They generate conflicts because each cultural entity or nation has its own collective God image that reigns supreme, and who then tends to project the devil, the opposite, onto some contrasting collective culture or country. So psychological understanding of the perversity of unconscious identification and projection needs to be standard teaching everywhere, to the point where overt shadow projection will then be immediately recognized and condemned. Pay. It would seem important for people to find psychologically enlightened ways to renew their sense of idealism around America. You've given us a lot of new perspectives in that regard, but in closing, Could you say more about what it means to be a more conscious citizen or patriot? Edinger. The collective unconscious has a national layer in it, or I'm sorry, the collective unconscious has a national layer in it. It's not the deepest layer, but it's a real layer in the collective unconscious. And patriotism is an authentic religious phenomenon. It's an authentic relation to the transpersonal psyche on the national level. And for a nation to be healthy, the populace needs to have a living connection to that level of the transpersonal psyche. If that's a conscious connection, then it's not just mindless jingoism. Not at all. Rather, it's an aspect of the religious function of the psyche that is required for healthy living for the individual. It would be wonderful if some of our political leaders had the psychological vision to be able to communicate and articulate something to that sort for the nation. It would certainly help us as we go through the ordeals that are in store for us as the ethnic and ideological and political factions fragment more and more. It would be a unifying counterposition to the fragmentation. Pay. Could you go even further into the question of what it means to be an American citizen? Edinger. Yes, what does it mean to be an American citizen? That is the question. It means all the things that I've been talking about. It means my realization that I participate in this historical process that I've been describing, that is America, because we really are the last best hope of the world. And if we as individuals and as a nation understand the historical role that we're performing for the ongoing historical process that I just briefly outlined, that gives America and its citizens a sense of its transpersonal purpose. And ultimately, that process has at its roots the individuation of the world. Pay. And by individuation, you mean a world that's whole and unified, like the image of the planet Earth as seen from space. Edinger. Yes, that's a good question. What does the individuation of the world mean? It's a kind of symbolic statement in itself. And as soon as you start to define it, you lessen it. It's a sizable notion to take all that we mean by the word individuation, all that Jung has elaborated in his work as belonging to the individuation process, and apply that to the historical process of the world unfolding. Just to make that connection generates reflection. I don't know if I'm capable of defining it more precisely. Pay. Does it have to do with a different state of consciousness or awareness? Edinger. Individuation is something that takes place in individuals. Collectivities do not carry consciousness. Individuals do. So the individuation of the world means a conscious wholeness predominating in the world, and that will occur only when a sufficient number of individuals have achieved consciousness of wholeness. And when that has taken place, then the world itself becomes whole. Pay. And individuation, from the way that you describe it, is a very distinct process from individuality. End of interview. So I've been reading the interview of Pythia Pei in America on the Couch. She was interviewing Dr. Edward Edinger. The interview took place in 1994, so before many of the divisive things that Dr. Edinger predicted, but nonetheless came true. And he died in 1998, so he didn't even see 9/11. So and And so Twin Aquarius says, I was just thinking about this stuff yesterday. Right. And so if any of you want to come on and chat with me in video, I have my headset here, and at the top of the YouTube chat, I put the link if you want to join me. But otherwise, let me just say that I had spontaneously come to this conclusion myself many years ago, long before I met Pythia Pei and knew anything about her book, which wasn't published until 2015, I think. But I had been traveling around the world, and I was asking people all over the world, and I've traveled a heck of a lot. I've lived overseas for 10 years and 8 years in Japan and a couple of years in India and probably 6 months in Saudi Arabia, believe it or not, among many other countries. And so in all those travels, I would ask people that I encountered what one factor above all others made the United States unique, and why the United States had the strongest military and the strongest economy. And in most cases, when I asked that question, it was like a stump the stars question. People would just go, and they just couldn't think of what special thing applied to the United States that didn't apply to others. And ultimately, it came to me that the unique feature of our country is that we do have this diversity from all over the world, every race, religion, creed, ethnic possibility in the world, and from every country of the world. And we have one special golden feature, which is that every time a good idea comes up from any quarter, we all adopt it very rapidly, and that even spreads out into the rest of the world. So, for example, Starbucks was a good idea, and it very rapidly spread out around the United States, and now it is spread out around the world. And even though it was founded by a man who's a known Zionist, I always found it rather ironic that in the hospital I was working in Saudi Arabia, there are actually 4 Starbucks cafes, or the last time I was there, there were 4 in the building, in the hospital. It's a very large hospital. It covers about 100 acres through long passageways and so on. So in that hospital, there are 4 Starbucks restaurants, and this is in the capital of Saudi Arabia. So that's a good idea that is spread around the world, whereas bad ideas, a bad idea being the example of slavery, gets beaten out of the system ultimately. I mean, obviously we have many troubles and dislocations because of our racial divides and so on in this country, and it's going to take centuries more for all of those to be overcome. But still it's true that enough Americans got together in the 1860s, the early 1860s, and literally beat formalized slavery out of the system in the United States. And so now we're continuing to deal with the other manifestations of that which still exist in our society. And one of those is private prisons, where we've made it now a profit-making operation. And so therefore, we have judges who give very long sentences to young people who make a single mistake, and then the prison rents out their labor for like 23 cents an hour or something to American businesses. And so if that's not still slavery, I don't know what is. It certainly is slavery. And there certainly is slavery around the world, although most countries don't admit to it, but it's certainly present in many countries. And so the point is, though, that bad ideas get forced out of the system, sometimes slowly, as is the example of slavery. But, you know, think for yourself, were you even thinking of the thought that private prisons were a form of slavery? But it is. And now that you know that, maybe things will change on that in the future. One can hope, because it's appalling what we've done with some of America's youth. It's really troubling. But anyway, the point is that the strength of the country is that we'll adopt a good idea from anyone, and bad ideas get pushed out of the system very rapidly. And so let's hope that that continues. And, you know, the evidence that what Dr. Edinger was saying, that this is true, is that we have immigrants and people desiring to immigrate from every country in the world. And I think we're the only country in the world that has people wanting to immigrate from every country. And, you know, that speaks for itself. People see that no matter how things are in their own country, they would be better off in the United States, even though we have lots of flaws also. But, you know, as we see what's happening in the UK recently with the vote, the Prime Minister wants to take Britain, United Kingdom, out of the European Union. And so there's a split, like a split at the time of Reformation in the Catholic Church. And that split, it appears, may lead to a split of the United Kingdom. So in another 2 to 5 years, it might be possible that there will be separate countries of England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland would probably become a part of Ireland. And so the question remains whether Wales would stay a part of the United Kingdom or a part of England, or would also split. But it seems quite evident that the possibility of Scotland and Northern Ireland splitting out of the United Kingdom is very real. And, you know, that's not a good thing for the future of the country. And so a country that at one time was one of the strongest countries of the world is now getting whittled down. And so we need to pay attention to these issues. And, you know, these are the same psychological issues that Dr. Edinger was referring to in this interview. So I hope this has been useful to you. I am going to go along now. Hopefully my wife, who was watching a movie called Alpha Gate about the interaction between realities in 2 different dimensions, and not realizing that that's exactly what I was doing here between me and you, interacting. You know, hopefully her movie is over and we can have our Sunday supper. So thank you, Gray, once again for your very kind super chat. And I'd urge any of my other followers, if they want to be kind at Christmas time, to remember the possibility of a super chat at Christmas time. That is always appreciated. And we will be having a session. We will be having sessions tomorrow and on the Monday before Christmas with the regular reading group. There won't be a session on the 30th of December because I won't be able to do it that day. But there is still one advanced reading group session this Wednesday, and that will be the last session until January. But I look forward to seeing you all then. And Nancy says, I really appreciate you reading this interview. Thank you, Nancy. I'm delighted to hear it, and I'm delighted to see you here with me. That's great. And we had a good following for today's reading. Most of the time, I am going to be reading more of this book, America on the Couch, Psychological Perspectives on American Politics and Culture. But most of these readings from this book are going to be on a separate channel, which is my political psychology channel. And so you're encouraged to go over there and follow me also there. And there you can hear more of the contents of Pythia's book. And I will, when the replay is set up on YouTube of this conversation, I will put a link to the political psychology channel at the top of the description of this video. So anyway, thank you very much for joining me. I'm going to excuse myself for now. Peace.